Hello, welcome to the keynote live question and answer session for Paul Stenner. We're going to wait a minute for some more participants to come into the chat room or to come online. We'd invite you to post your questions to the chat button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll go from there. All right, well, we'd like to welcome Paul to the chat. So if you could come on in, we'll start our discussion. All right.
Hello, Zach.
Hi. Well, thank you, first of all, so much for that wonderful, really excellent talk that I think provided some really keen analysis on another way of thinking about crisis, offering an alternative framework that is rich and really, I think, captures in a way what we're experiencing right now that goes beyond a lot of the typical discourse that we're hearing about crisis, right? Both in academia as well as in kind of popular discourse. So first of all, just a comment, thank you for that. I think it's left a lot of us. I already hear in the chat, there's roaring applause from Madrid. So I think this is a really important and helpful way of thinking about what we're going through right now, but even more broadly, right? As we deal with, as you've talked about, this kind of recurring crises that seem to be plaguing us for decades in so many different areas. So maybe let me just start off with the question. I do think you capture that key tension, right? That we're experiencing of having to both act quickly, but also to not pause. I like that. Like that metaphor it's being used, but it's not really apt. But to slow down, to dwell, to stay with the problem, right? And so this tension is really at the heart, I feel like, of what you're arguing, and that paradox. And one of the questions that I have, and I think you get at, and maybe if you could unpack this a little bit more, but how is it that we can avoid the crisis of finding easy solutions quickly, but also avoid that, from what I understand, a liminal hotspot that turns into a permanent state, right? That somehow we can't get out of. So I don't know if you could say a little bit more.
Yeah, thank you very much, Zach. Yeah, and I think you're right that is very much at the core of what I'm trying to propose. That in some respects, if you take seriously the impact on human subjectivity, both individual and collective, of sort of major disruptive events, liminal events, which especially those liminal events which, if you like, take us by surprise, the spontaneously occurring liminal events. If we take seriously the impact of those on subjectivity, then we have to really think about how we get through that process, how it, if you like, impacts our sense-making. We need to make new sense of the world following such a transformation. And especially when, literally something new comes into the world that we don't have resources, semantic resources for making sense of. In a sense, during that phase, we need to make new sense. We need novelty in sense making that is equivalent to the novelty that we're needing to come to terms with in our experience. And so if we rush too quickly through these liminal experiences, we don't give ourselves the time to adequately digest and make sense of what we're going through. And again, both individually and socially. And so I think it provides an interesting way of thinking broadly about history as well. To what extent, for example, is the sort of Kantian universalism that started to dominate the way we think in the 18th and 19th century, or even before that, to what extent are those ways of thinking the result of going too fast through liminal transformations without actually adequately thinking through the semantics that we're using? So that's why I think, ideas remain important, but we need to actually really think through how we're thinking about these situations. So yes, you can, if you don't adequately think them through, you can get stuck in that transitional phase. And I think everybody is somehow familiar with this idea of being held suspended, stuck in a transition. Although it's a paradox, how can you be both stuck and changing? And yet we know that that's true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, great. Now, here's a question from Ernst Schraub. Thanks for your great talk. I have two connected questions. One, would you see learning processes as a central element of dwelling on liminality? Are there specific conditions which enable dwelling constructively with liminal hotspots?
Yes, I would say that in a sense, the way in which I've come to think about liminal hotspots always involves a sort of contrast between, as I mentioned in the talk, the concept of the liminal comes out of rites of passage literature, anthropological literature, looking at the way in which human transitions and transformations are culturally scaffolded by rituals and so on. Now, in that kind of circumstance, we sort of know in advance that the change is going to happen, and we sort of facilitate circumstances for that change for ourselves collectively. And so in those circumstances, in some respects, the paradoxes that I've suggested always come to the fore in a liminal situation are tolerated, expected. We don't sort of harshly judge somebody for experiencing something unusual. We sort of even encourage it in a ritualistic situation. And so you can imagine a sort of ideal typical contrast between a situation where the polarizations, the paradoxes, the likelihood of panic and so on that go with a liminal situation are either tolerated and encouraged, facilitated, or really cracked down on, right, with a sort of separation response to liminality that I mentioned crisis tends to have. We have no time for that, just do this rather than do that. So you can imagine two ideal typical circumstances for the going through of a liminal crisis, one of them which actually encourages, facilitates, tolerates and so on, one of which is intolerant. And I think the latter can be deeply problematic because people then get stuck in their fixations, get stuck in their polarized positions, because there's no time to, if you like, I think of it like a knot that you pull it tightly, it's impossible to ever undo it. If you create relaxed circumstances where you can begin to unravel the knot and understand how the knot comes together and is put together, then you can sort of produce a more adequate resolution of the situation. So thanks, Ernst, for that question. That's how I would sort of begin thinking about the occasioning circumstances in which you can actually transform for the better during a liminal situation.
We have another question from Floor Van Alphen. Do you think that Francois Hartog's notion of presentism or presentist regime of time somehow connects to the ideas you presented?
I must confess that I've not read Francois Hartog's notion of presentism or presentist regime, so I have to confess my ignorance, Floor. But the idea of presentism, I mean, it does seem very, very close to what I'm talking about, I think if it makes me think of, for example, Jacques Derrida's idea of a sort of metaphysics of presence. I think that I would want to sort of connect that to this idea of the two experiences of time that I tried to sort of very quickly sketch, not knowing Hartog's work, I must just apologize and reflect it back to you. Please tell me about it and explain to me why it's relevant and so on, and I'd be very happy with that.
All right. Great, thank you. All right, Gordana Jovanovic asked, or comments, thank you so much, Paul. Would you agree that dealing with the liminal as you described it should be a way to avoid some crisis in the sense of necessity of fast, unprepared actions? I mean to be a way of engaging with the processes, and most importantly, with humans in a different way.
Yes, thank you, Gordana. Exactly. That, I think you've expressed very clearly what I would hope to be possible. I think that some sort of integration, as I was thinking about it, you know, my diagnosis of liminal situations is that during liminal situations, because things get paradoxical, because you're no longer just in that world where an either or logic might work, or in that world where another either or logic might work, but you're in this middle world where things become both and hence become paradoxical. So we respond to those paradoxes often by, for example, just a paradox is something that contains, let's say, at least two elements, both of which are true if you follow them through, and yet they are mutually contradictory and incompatible. So faced with a paradox, we can just focus on just one aspect of it, for example, and we think we then get out of the paradox. And in normal situations, we might, but in a liminal situation, you don't, because the other side of the paradox is equally sort of pertinent. So polarization onto one side of a paradox is actually ultimately an unproductive way of managing paradox in a liminal situation. And so one such polarization is this polarization between, if you like, ideals, the dreamers, the people who think of future possibilities, and the practical fast action people. And we tend to, you know, I probably fall more on the dreamer side, so I like sort of dwelling in possibilities, but I'm very well aware that that can be fatal if you don't have a way of actually connecting with the real practical pressing issues which come thick and fast in crisis situations. So above all in a crisis, you need to be, if you like, to be able to feed some of the stuff from the dreamer, some of the ideals, some of the vision into the practice, and vice versa, feed some of the practical know-how into the dreams and ideals. So it's not just that we should say, you know, don't act fast. You do need to act fast in a crisis. The paradox is that you also somehow need not to act fast. You need some people who are not necessarily immediately leaping into action. You need the synthesis of both of those, and it's precisely that synthesis that gets challenged and gets difficult to sustain in the liminal situation. So yeah, that's how I would frame that.
Okay, great. Now I had a question. If we look at the liminal phase as this really indeterminate, you know, kind of in between, betwixt and between, you know, messy, paradoxical, is there a way that you would sense when do we move out in this particular instance, right, in this pandemic, to the post-liminal, right, to this kind of period of incorporation or the phase of incorporation? Is there a way, when do we know, or how can we tell when we move out of it?
Well, or it's maybe also pertinent to ask whether we ever will move out of it in a sort, you know, I think the idea that the danger with thinking in terms of liminality in the way that I've sketched it is that you can sort of imagine that you're moving somehow between one solid state and another solid state, and that it's just a question of getting through that bridge. But actually, those solid states are never really solid states. It's only a relative solidity compared to the liminal phase of the moment. And actually, what we need to do in some respects is we need to learn to live with more volatility, with if you like, a heightened sensitivity to the liminal, but without, if you like, crashing into a crass becoming fascistic, which is one clear response to the liminal, or you know, other comparable polarizations. We need to be able to learn to live in more liminal ways, but in a way that we can render those precisely livable. Because, you know, I think the world that we, if you like, left behind pre-pandemic, it was for many people just not a livable life. You know, it was livable for a small minority who were benefiting from it enormously, but for, you know, vast swathes of humanity, it was not a terribly livable existence. So we need to, if you like, get right the balance between allowing a degree of liminality in and recognizing that life is process, that things do constantly change and so on. You know, and looming in the background of all this is, of course, the looming you know, environmental crisis that we're facing. And so we really do need to sort of change our ways of thinking to live in sustainable ways. And I think that requires, you know, probably a permanent attentiveness to this sort of liminal logic.
Mm-hmm. Now, okay, the one maybe following up on that, I really like this idea of the scales, the different levels, right, that you introduced towards the end of your talk. Would this connect in the sense that at these different scales, at these different levels, we're going to have different tensions, right, different ways of negotiating, right, this liminality, right, from the very biological to the personal to the societal, right, that there is not a seamless way of living through, right, that at one level, right, you're going to have to operate differently than at another level, at a personal level, or even at a different societal, social organization, right, the people coming closer together with families, with different relationships, maybe changed and altered for the better, but in other ways, at other levels, being very problematic. So I'm just, could this be developed, right, to look at that, to integrate, right, liminality then at different levels between, as you mentioned, these levels as well?
Yes, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, Zach, because, you know, one of the things that I think we're sort of sadly missing in not just in psychology, but in the sciences more generally is a logic of transdisciplinarity. It's as if we've given up the idea that there might be continuities across the physical, the organic, the psychological, the sociological. And we certainly don't have a clear transdisciplinary metaphysics or you know, or logic. In fact, you know, if you talk to most people, metaphysics is the one thing that we agree in damning. You know, what we don't want above all is to be metaphysicians. And yet, you know, only 100 years ago, you know, there were very sophisticated metaphysical positions that were trying to work out ways in which you can think using similar dynamics, although, you know, clearly the biological has its own logic and you need to respect the autonomy of the logic of the biological. Nevertheless, there is a direct continuity with the psychological and with the sociological that we need to be able to articulate if we're going to have a sort of sense of a lucid and coherent worldview that we can then sort of, you know, share within the sciences in order not to, you know, in order not to get bogged down and so on. And so I think that for me, the baton of metaphysics, once people like Whitehead and Bergson were sort of written out of the picture somehow, was taken up by people like systems theorists, structuralists, who began to articulate general scientific, in this case, not philosophical ways of linking together the encyclopedia of knowledge. And I find there's some really very rich resources in rethought. Both system theory and structuralism went through revolutions. So, you know, we now consider ourselves post-structuralists. That means we considered the structuralist generalist solutions to be, you know, inadequate. And then in the same way, systems theory has gone through various sort of transformations. But now there are really sophisticated systems theoretical ways of thinking about these things that can give us a transdisciplinary vocabulary that we can be a bit more confident about, that I think we need in terms of the the robustness of our intellectual positions. So yes, I think that's really important, that for me, liminality scholarship opens up some directions for engaging with that question.
Yeah, great, thank you. One maybe final question. Flor kind of follows up. According to Hartog, presentism is the feeling of being stranded in the present, an experience of time in which the present is omnipresent and the past fulfills an identity function rather than being a guide for planning in the future. In such cases, there does not seem to be much of a horizon beyond the present day, as the past becomes of little use in order to plan for the future. So if I relate to his ideas, I'd ask, how much can we imagine for the future when we're stuck in the middle?
Well, that's very useful, Flor. Thank you for that. Yeah, that concept of, if you like, presentism as a sort of entrapment in the present moment is very useful, and that for me is part of why it's really important to articulate an adequate concept of the psychological, because a lot of psychology, as Anathasios talked about in the presentation before mine, psychologizes. And in psychologizing, it sort of has this myth of a sort of self-contained individual that if only, you know, if you like, there's this sort of fetishizing of the brain of an individual, as if you could find all the answers to psychology in that brain within the individual, and then sort of pan them out, and then you've got the explanations you want. Now, that kind of psychologizing, which starts with a already sort of really preposterous idea of a self-contained individual, that is a psychologization that entraps us within our own individuality, entraps us within a sort of very limited understanding of the present. And it traps us, again, without a transdisciplinary vision of how we are part of a broader nature that is, if you like, in one sense, a unity. We're not ultimately, well, of course, we're different from frogs, but we're also very connected to them, and the same with all the other things. This is the value of having a transdisciplinary account, is that it prevents you from this sort of, you know, very isolated concept of a psyche, and that's a very real danger. I mean, one of the very negative possibilities that comes from the corona lockdown scenario is that we're all now used to being much more isolated in little bubbles, in, you know, we're all on screens looking at, you know, the world through our, you know, our access to social media and so on, and that itself is a sort of, it can be a way of getting out beyond yourself, but it's very likely also to entrap us within a sort of almost decapitated sociality, that can produce this sort of, you know, sense of a present with nothing beyond the now. And, you know, human history has been, you know, in some sense, if you talk to people from you know, parts of the world that have not been so infected with this sort of modern madness in some respects, they have a much clearer sense of their own individual lodging within, for example, a family history, a societal history, a sort of chronology that goes back in time. This idea of being just one isolated self in a now, you know, is a very peculiar product of a modern way of thinking, which is, I think, extremely damaging and dangerous. And so, you know, that's my sort of riffing on your Herzog clarification, which is, yeah, I should probably stop. Thank you.
Well, no, good riffing, and as well as guitar earlier. We're gonna have to end it now. We're gonna move this over to Slack. There are a couple more questions. So if you have any others, please post them. Again, thank you for everyone participating, especially Paul for being here with us today, and for your contribution. We appreciate that. And have a wonderful day, and we'll see you hopefully face to face sometime.
Thank you, Zach, and I'd like to express my thanks to the organisers of this conference again, because I think it's a very good thing to have done at this moment. And I think that although they've set the bar very high for future conferences, because it's been done so quickly and so effectively, so I think I very much appreciate it, and I'm sure I'm not the only one.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.